honor today to begin by speaking Sunday, July 8th, 2007, with perhaps my #1 hero, Nebraska Senator John DeCamp, because he has looked evil with the capital E, square in the eye, and he did not blink.
Because I didn't know any better. I didn't realize what I was getting into. That's stupid. And then when I got in so deep, I had to keep going.
I strongly urge people to read his book, The Franklin Coverup, and watch the movie Conspiracy of Silence, so you can better digest the information we're going to talk about today. Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm especially grateful for you to agree to being interviewed today, because it's just been barely a month, maybe 5 or 6 weeks since you had major back surgery.
Oh God, yes.
Can you tell us what you can about that?
Well, there was once something that you may remember called the Vietnam War, and silly little folk like me ended up there. I was a captain, infantry captain over in Vietnam, and I was assigned directly to Bill Colby he was officially deputy ambassador there, but he was technically head of the CIA over there. He created something called the Phoenix program, and I was assigned to help him develop and implement that. And one day I was rappelling with a team, and you know what rappelling is?
Yeah.
You go down cliffs, real steep cliffs or mountains or whatever on
Do
the
you have
rope.
any idea how far off the ground you were?
I think it was 40 to 50 feet.
Was it ground or was it rock?
I will tell you the truth, I didn't carefully examine it. It was hard and it hurt, and I had to be carried off. And so anyway,
And
the pain, the problems created then ended up with...
because the rope broke, we didn't mention.
Yeah, well,
or
was shot.
was
But
shot
anyway, what happens so frequently is you do some damage at this point, and it slowly shows up over the years. And back, in this case, destruction to the back that causes degeneration of the discs and all that. So this is the 5th operation I've had now in the last 5 years, and this was kind of like the ultimate and total one where I got the biggest scar you'll ever see in your life, from right here down to you know where. And each individual disc or vertebrae, they put dead people's bones in, and screws and bolts and...
But it was live
plates.
bone tissue probably that can graft.
It was from dead people, that's all I know. At least I assume they were dead when they took them from them and put them in.
But not very long dead, probably.
Let's hope not.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what they did, and I'm hoping it works, but right now the way it feels, I don't think it is.
It's hurting like a...
It hurts like a, you know what.
Yeah.
Have you watched the news media this morning? Was the best example.
No.
Oh, you may have heard, I'm sure everybody heard, about all the new information being released by the CIA.
Yes, but I thought it was just kind of...
No, this is the very things that Colby, you know, got fired for, trying to get out by Kissinger when Ford became president. And got several stories on that to tell you, when Colby and Kissinger and I were all together over in Paris at the Paris Peace Talk tables. But
And you were there.
Yep, sitting with Colby and Kissinger. Anyway, this was after the Vietnam War, you know, and they were returning to memorialize and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this stuff coming out, you know, just like Colby was always telling me, and I hinted at some of it in my book about the assassinations and the CIA being out of control and being almost a government to itself, and Colby realizing that he had helped create this monster and had an obligation to try to correct it. And that's why he tried to go before the Senate and release what he came to be called the family jewels, you know, the violations, the breakings of the law the CIA had done, and he was fired and shut up and everything. And that was his reason. And as you know, he was the one that literally inspired me, made me write the book.
Yes.
As a self-defense measure.
Right.
And that's what he was trying to do when he went before the U.S. Senate with that information. The CIA had become like a government unto itself, following no rules, accountable to anybody. And he realized that was dangerous for this country. And that's why he went before the Congress of the United States, which resulted in the church committee hearings and all those things.
Right.
You're probably too young to remember.
Well, and Gary Hart was on that
Anyway,
church committee.
and went before them and revealed what they called the family jewels, the family secrets, things they had done that crossed the line. Anyway, that was why he wanted me to write this book as a self-defense measure, but also to set the things in pace to maybe try to correct some of these things. Anyway, I'm blabbering too much.
No, please blabber. Is it true that
blabber.
Is it true that he was secretly hired to investigate Gary Caradori's death?
Oh yeah, that was a secret, but it didn't become much of a secret any longer because everybody came to know that in Nebraska. He was hired by the Senate.
Okay.
And like he told me, I don't know, his words, if it's done right, in other words, eliminating somebody, you'll never be able to prove just who did it, blah, blah, blah.
Well, but there's a lot of suspicious circumstances around his death.
Suspicious? Beyond suspicious. I'm sure. In my own mind, I have no doubt.
What do you know beyond
he was killed to shut him up.
The half-eaten meal left on his plate and the computers
first of all,
left on?
you got to know Bill Colby. He was a meticulous, perfect man. He wouldn't have a hair out of place. So here he is on his little vacation place out on Chesapeake Bay or whatever it is, and I'd been there with him before. We'd gone boating, and going boating with him was like not very exciting because everything had to be absolutely perfect. You know what I mean? So here, supposedly, he's by himself in his little cabin. He's eating his supper, got his TV on, and he gets up, leaves his house supposedly, leaves his TV on, his food half-eaten, lights on, doors unlocked, wanders off and starts to go boating in the evening. No, not in 100 years. And then he disappears for 10 days and then suddenly floats to the surface after half the world is looking for him, the CIA and everybody, floats to the surface right there at the dock, 10 days later.
At the dock in front of his place?
Right where he supposedly went down to get his boat. Anyway, floats to the dock, floats up, and looks like he just got out of the bathtub. It didn't have any,
No water in his lungs.
Anyway, I know from other sources, and someday I'll be writing about this too. He was done in to shut him up. He was talking too much and going to other places and trying to correct sins of the CIA, which he believed in totally. The CIA is necessary, but it had to have accountability too.
Right.
And it had become a monster out of control.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about what you attempted to accomplish with the second edition of your book that was updated from the first?
Basically that, an update, new developments, new proofs, so on and so forth from the proof, whether it was some of the incidental events I'd been involved in. I represented the kids in Columbine, and I represented the grand jury on the Oklahoma bombing, and each one of these has a little more information, but that isn't what the book's about, of course. The book about is Franklin Coverup, which is this network of people I couldn't believe existed in the world, and the whole reason I got involved was my stupidity. When all these stories started coming out in Nebraska on the streets from young people saying, oh, I know this man, Mr. Larry King, not the Larry King TV today, but a Larry King that was a black man in Nebraska, very prominent in the Republican Party. In fact, officially, he was called the fastest rising black star in the Republican Party, and he was the one that opened both the 84 and 88 Republican National Conventions, sang the national anthem, all that.
Could you please...
Had the biggest parties at the Republican conventions they've ever had. I know I was there. I was a delegate to the Republican National Convention.
The one was at, what was that ranch in Dallas?
South Fork.
South Fork.
Yeah, that's where his party was. South Fork Ranch. If you remember that TV drama Dallas, that's where our party was. It was a heck of a party.
Okay.
He had Maureen Reagan.
You're right.
Draped all over him all night, wandering around like some kind of a huge blanket. Maureen Reagan, the president's daughter back then. Well, she still is, I guess.
Of course, now if you've seen or read the book, you know that Larry King was convicted. You successfully got a $1 million judgment on behalf of Paul Benassi. But has he seen any actual money from that?
No. We have not been able to collect. He's been in prison. Well, he's out now. He got released finally, but I don't know whether we'll ever collect.
Well, now I thought he got out shortly after he was sent into prison, just so he could go to the Republican National Convention and sing the anthem again.
No. Not
No.
to the best of my knowledge.
No, he's stayed in prison continuously?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for clearing
And
that.
he's been out for a couple years now.
So he was in from what, 80?
No, in the 90s sometime.
92, 91, 92?
I don't know the exact date,
till
but
just
I'm
recently?
going to say 90. No, till maybe a year or two ago. Year and a half, whatever.
We got a little
Oh,
comeuppance.
he got off easy.
Yeah, he did. How did you become involved with exposing the Catholic diocese, the corruption with because?
Well, this is a strange story because, believe it or not, when I was a young boy, I lived in a monastery studying to be a Catholic priest. I don't think you knew that.
No, I didn't know that.
It's the truth.
Okay.
In fact, I'm going there this summer for a reunion. Haven't been back in 40 years or more.
Because how old were you when you went up to Minnesota?
Same as so many other little boys, which, by the way, has pretty well been eliminated here in America in the Catholic Church. You used to be about 14, and you'd go to the seminary. And of course, I discovered somewhere along the line, even though I wasn't around them, because we were all boys there, that those girl creatures, you know, they kind of were attractive, and I was kind of wondering what it would be like to, well, anyway. So I figured eventually I probably wasn't cut out to abandon
Vow
them.
of celibacy?
Yeah, so I left after a few years. Anyway, yeah, my lawsuit was the first of its kind in the United States of America, by the way, that for the first time exposed this problem of priests, Catholic priests, having problems with young boys and so on and so forth. And having seen, in a sense, both sides of this equation, from the seminary side and the whatever, and the other side where I filed the lawsuit and won the $1 million judgment. And it was the first of its kind in the United States against the Catholic Church for this activity and first exposed it.
Well, what brought you to that conclusion that it needed, what evidence did you...
This Franklin
Okay,
case.
okay.
We had one after another kid come forward
Okay.
and tell about the priest and the priest and the priest.
Okay.
For criminy sakes, you think I just grabbed it out of the air?
No, but I didn't know the timeline as to if it was before that.
When the first information started coming out, let me give you a little history. There was a place called the Franklin Credit Union. It was run by this man named Larry King, a black man who, as I say, was very prominent in the Republican Party.
In Omaha.
In Omaha, Nebraska. And when all the credit unions and banks were having difficulties back there in the late 80s, early 90s or whenever, his went belly up. And after that, no big deal. A lot of others went belly up across the country. But then stories started floating out on the street that there had been all kinds of money missing. And then the federal credit union officials raided the credit union and found there was $40 million missing. And that's pretty serious. So
Now, in your book, didn't you say that that sort of impropriety could not happen without the complicit behavior from the highest levels of the banking institutions?
which kind of behavior?
I'm not sure.
Either neglect. The credit unions were not very well regulated in Nebraska then. Remember, it was state regulation.
And you were on
Of
the
course,
state banking
when I was a senator, I was chairman, head of the bank.
chairman. Okay.
And so, when this word came out that $40 million was missing, then stories started floating all over publicly from young people, kids here. Well, I know Larry King. I used to fly on his private plane to Washington, D.C. and provide sex for this or that congressman or this or that public official, and other kids this and that, and so on and so forth. And I was asked by the media my opinion on this. And I said, this has to be the craziest thing I've ever heard of. I said, you can't have that going on. I mean, if that were really occurring, rest assured, it would have been exposed and known a long time ago. And then I got my bluff called a little bit. I got a letter from a kid who had been picked up on the night the credit union was raided. A kid named Paul Benassi. And he was put in jail because he had touched He was about 17, 18 years old. He had touched his cousin, supposedly, on his private parts on the outside of his pants when they were in bed together at his house. Now, how that warrants taking a 17-year-old kid and locking him up in jail immediately. But anyway, Paul Bonassi wrote me this letter. He said, well, Mr. DeCamp, I know you don't believe any of this, but if you come see me, I could show you, I could prove to you that this is true, and that there's horrible things occurring and all kinds of young people being involved in this, and providing sexual favors and treatment and pay, and on and on and on. And I thought, well, what the heck. I put my mouth out there and said, this couldn't be possible. He's calling my bluff, I better go see him. So I went to the jail where he was locked up in Omaha, Nebraska. And I used my position a little bit to get in to see him. And as I was going in, this other very prominent looking man was coming out. I introduced myself. He said, oh yeah, Senator DeCamp, I know you. Anyway, and I said, who are you? And he says, he was a psychiatrist examining this boy Bonassi. And I thought, holy mackerel, this is the guy I want to ask him. I said, well, is he telling you these crazy stories? He said, yes, he is. And I said, I'm sure there's no truth to any of them, but you don't believe any of them, do you? He said, I believe everything. I says, what? You're a psychiatrist, yes? He says, I've examined him and examined him and examined him. I says, and you think he's telling the truth? He says, not only is he telling the truth, he's not capable of lying. I said, what? How can that be anybody's capable? He said, well, he is what's called a multiple personality. And I said, what the... Anyway, he said he doesn't lie, he simply switches personalities, and that personality tells what they know. So anyway, I went in to see him, and he told me his story, and then he told me something else. He said, when I was a little boy, my grandpa taught me and made me write a diary. Every day, keep a diary of my life, every day. He said it would be important, blah, blah, blah. He said, so I've done that. And he says, I have a diary of everything going back, when I was just a little boy of my life. And he says, it's hidden, and he told me where it was hidden in some corner of a house or under some, and I thought, well, he says, you can go get it and you can read. And I didn't write it today or yesterday or make this up. He says, I wrote all these things over the years. And he was, one of those strange kids, kind of broken family and screwed up family and everything. Anyway, so I went and got that and had that examined and learned that the thing had to have been written in those years, because the ink, they can actually analyze, they can take something that was written, let's say, with ink in 20 years ago, and they pretty well can identify the age and if it was really done that in the paper and all that junk, you know what I mean? Believe me, I don't know how to do it, but I had it forensically analyzed by two separate outfits, and they concluded, yeah, this was written at this time and over these years. And
well, it's so fortuitous that you were the one that got to retrieve
that. Then was in the midst of a real horrible problem, that problem being okay, because when I had originally heard all these stories, I said, if I really believed any of this stuff, I'd be the first to step forward and do something about it. And I realized that, as I say, I was up to my in alligators, because either I had to put my money in actions where my mouth was, or be in my own mind. Anyway, so I started working on this case, and it turned into the biggest monster I've ever encountered, and into a world I did not believe existed, could not believe existed, and even to this day, strange as this is going to sound, terrible as this is going to sound, I'll say it, I wish I knew nothing about it. I wish I were still kind of sweet and innocent and didn't know anything about any of this.
Yeah, we can only imagine how different your life would have been.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and along those lines, because it's so vast, and because there's so many pieces to it, do you think that because there's Satanism involved, do you think that...
well, Satanism...
Is that just the collective beliefs of a bunch of people and they can make it happen? Or is it too permeating?
Satanism, satanic cults, this kind of thing. I don't know if they're Satanists or just evil people with their that's just one factor in this whole thing. You know, if I were drawing a line 1 to 100 and said, well, this is one element, this is 2% or 5%, this is an element, this is an element, and these are all factors, I expose that because it seems to be one of the elements in this whole picture of using children for literally satisfying the perversions of adults. And
back to the Catholic diocese.
It was only after I found and verified and validated my case there that I finally filed this lawsuit on behalf of this boy against Larry King and certain others, including the number one defendant was the Omaha Catholic Archdiocese and the Catholic Church, and a Catholic priest there.
And then what point did you get the audience with the Pope?
That was after the Catholic Church had been dismissed out of it. In fact, the judge, I can still remember, reprimanding me and saying, Mr. DeCamp, do you realize how outrageous this sounds? The most respected institution in America, Boys Town, one of the most... I said, yes, they are, and they're one of the most wonderful institutions ever created to help children, and they have. I said, but it's like anything else in the world, anything. You can have a cancer in there, and if you don't deal with it, it can spread. Unfortunately, that's the situation, so instead of avoiding it, let's face up to it and correct it.
So you did go to Vatican City.
I went to Vatican City, and you've heard of audiences with the Pope,
yeah,
right? Well, it's not quite like it sounds, like you're sitting there talking to the Pope. You're in a group of maybe 100 people or more, or, you know, but a bunch of people. The Pope comes out and rings a bell and signs. Anyway, and then he says a few words, and that's pretty much it. It's not like you're going to discuss much with him individually. Instead, I was immediately referred to a man, a cardinal, who's in charge of, well, at that time it was North American Affairs or something. And I then met personally with this man, and Cardinal, and he looks at me, and I've told him the whole story, and I asked what I should do and told him about the lawsuit, and he says, keep it up, keep it up, keep it up, keep fighting. He says, the North American Church doesn't listen to Rome. We know about this problem, it's very severe, and someday it's going to hurt the church. This is what the man told me, looking right at him. Now this is the top cardinal in Rome in charge of North American affairs and whatever. Anyway, and he gave me all the encouragement in the world and told me, yes, that was a serious problem, and the church in America said, we'll handle our affairs and deal with it, and so on. And so I felt a little discouraged, but I learned, and I just kept working on my project then.
And the name of this cardinal?
And the name of the cardinal was a guy named Cardinal, you can check it out, Ratzinger. Now, then I'm in my office 10 or 15 years later, watching on television, as they say, and now the new Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger. So the new Pope now, the existing Pope, is the one I met with then, and he was the one that told me it's a problem in America and it's out of control. I think this is the first time I've ever told this publicly.
You actually got your audience with the Pope?
So I had my audience with the Pope. It was just a little bit before he became the Pope. But it was interesting because at that time, my lawsuit, as I told you way back then, was the first one in the United States claiming this kind of problem, and the judge threw it out, dismissed, let out the church and the priest. But since then, I don't need to tell you the problem has surfaced, just like Ratzinger told me it would, just like it would haunt the church and have to be dealt with, just like he told me and promised and warned. It's interesting, you know, though, almost all the American seminaries now, I think all, virtually all, have the ones that take the children at about 14, like I was, and so on, to be priests. They've all pretty well disappeared. Did you know that? Now, the one I have was at, it's closed. As I was reading in some of the papers, some research the other day, that they're almost all closed now. You have to kind of be mature before you
It's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think so.
You just kind of skirted around your involvement with the Oklahoma City bombing. Is that something that you represented?
I represented the grand juror, Hoppy Heidelberg. Hoppy was on the grand jury, you know, that indicted McVeigh. But he heard enough there that he was upset and wanted to question more, which a grand juror normally has the right to do. See, unknown to most Americans, the grand jury is supposed to be an absolute machine where these people on the grand jury get to bring in witnesses and ask questions. And yes, the prosecutor, so to speak, is the one that arranges it, subpoenas, and brings them. But the prosecutor is supposed to listen to that grand jury. And Hoppy, speaking out for some of the other grand jurors, wanted to bring in other witnesses because information they gathered in the grand jury was that McVeigh wasn't alone. There were some other people and other things that he wanted to bring out. And the judge refused to let him do it and told him he would be punished and put in jail if he kept asking or pressing. So that's when I jumped in representing him and filed an action. And
While the grand jury was still convened?
yeah, well, the grand jury was still convened and wanted to maintain the building, keep the building up long enough to have a team go in there to examine it. Why? Because there were all kinds of questions about what really happened with this bomb. And I had hired this team, Joseph Kennedy and Associates, out of, I don't know, Chicago or New York or
In
somewhere.
relation to?
No, not Joseph Kennedy. Anyway, they were the ones that had done the World Trade Center bombing, one of those bombings in New York before.
Oh, the 1993.
Yeah, I think that was it. They were real prominent. I had them arranged, and at the last minute I got a call from McVeigh's attorney. McVeigh, you know who McVeigh was. And they said, hey, listen, we admire you and applaud what you're doing, but would you let us? Remember, this is a court-appointed attorney, I think. What was his name? I can't remember right now. But they were court-appointed. The government appointed him, to represent him, because supposedly he had no fun. Anyway, and he said, but since we're the main defendant, my client, we would have the highest priority to keep the building standing. And we could guarantee we could do it, whereas you're just representing kind of unknowns that may have an interest. Would you back off and let us have your firm, your investigating company you got on hold to do it? And I said, well, shoot, yeah, you'd be able to get it way quicker and you'd be guaranteed. So I agreed to that. Verbally on the phone when they called me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't 6 to 8 hours later, I'm watching TV. They seemed very quickly, not that day, I think. And they said both McVeigh's attorneys and the U.S. government have agreed now to destroy the building, and it'll be destroyed tomorrow morning. Blah, blah. And I went crazy, and I tried calling him. I couldn't get him up.
Had you known, would you
Something's
have not
fishy. I don't.
given your consent?
I'm still burning about it, and I still have funny feelings because. Oh, and how did they deal with the issue of the grand jury and my representing Mr. Heidelberg and some other grand jurors to have the grand jury ask more questions? Guess what? Go check the record. Instantly, the judge just dismissed the whole grand jury, so it no longer existed. First of all, the judge threatened to put Mr. Heidelberg in jail. Then when I got involved and started filing stuff, dismissed the whole grand jury. So I guess I've had a few things happen in this whole Franklin thing since I got involved, and that make me wonder sometimes, even as a senator, I never would have questioned most of these, but now in my old age I'm saying sometimes all that glitters is not gold, and all that we think is perfect may have some flaws, and we should keep our ears and eyes
What's
open.
happened to Hoppy Heidelberg since then?
Well, he wrote a book and he's been on 1,000 TV shows, and
Okay.
he's an old man.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I assume he's still alive, but he was quite a bit older than me. And I'm not a kid anymore.
You're not that old.
I'm a lot older than you dream.
Now,
How old do you think I am?
oh gosh, I don't know. That's not a fair question.
Go ahead, guess.
Let's see. If you were in Vietnam in late 60s,
Yep.
70, 80, 90, 35 years plus 30, 40, 55, hitting 60.
Oh, 60 went by a long time ago. Had a birthday yesterday, 2 days ago.
Happy birthday.
66. Jeez.
Happy birthday.
Don't I look young though? About 29.
You do.
28.
You do.
All
Especially
the
all-
girls should look at me and say, wow.
I'm going to splice in a picture of that on the wall there.
Oh yeah.
And just to show how...
See the other picture right next to it. You know who that black guy is with me in the picture?
This one right here?
Yep, that's in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center.
Kennedy Center.
Washington, D.C.
What was the occasion?
I was decorated as one of the 8 most outstanding Vietnam veterans for... I went back to Vietnam after I'd been a senator for 5 years, right as Saigon was falling in '75, organized Operation Baby Lift. Did you ever hear of Operation Baby Lift?
Yes, I did at the
I
time.
went back
even,
and
yeah.
organized Operation Baby Lift, brought out 2,834 of the mostly half American, half Vietnamese orphans that were being abandoned in the...
Because there's a lot of cultural stigma, right, in Vietnam with the half...
Oh yeah, half American, half Vietnamese.
So who is the black man in that photo?
Hank Aaron.
Really?
Hank Aaron, you've heard of
The
Hank
baseball
Aaron?
player, sure.
Yeah, he still holds the record.
Really?
Yep. He was the one selected to give the award there along with some other folk.
Were you a baseball fan?
No, I couldn't even spell baseball.
Well, he's one of
That was the year that he was, I think, 76 or something. He was the one that was selected because his name was better known than anybody on the planet then.
And that one over there?
That is my little boy Johnny with Johnny Rogers, who's my very, very close friend. Johnny Rogers is Nebraska's most famous by far football player ever, Heisman Trophy winner, king of the hill, and I represent Johnny on everything he does.
That has to be fun, so you can do that for your son.
Yeah, he goes every year with, he used to take my 2 girls skiing in Aspen, Colorado every year, so.
Huh. Back to the not so much fun stuff. Why do you think so much of this centers around Omaha? We've got Offutt Air Force Base, Strategic Air Command. We've got Chief Wadman of the police department there
Okay.
back in Boys
Book
Town. And
I wrote takes the Omaha link, let's put it that way, and there were key characters there in Omaha that were deeply involved in this. Larry King transporting kids, some from Boys Town, but whatever, from wherever, to Washington and other places for these things. They weren't just doing the sex things. The kids were used as drug couriers, heavy-duty drug couriers. Who can get through a line of people in a airport, particularly back in the 80s and 90s, you know, who could get through better than about a 10, 12-year-old kid that might have his pockets loaded with heroin or whatever. So they were used as drug couriers, they were used as sex tools, so on and so forth. Omaha is only one town where I was able to develop this whole thing because of the way it unfolded and the way I started pushing it with my litigation and everything else. And it was also, though, a demonstration of just how powerful and how deeply embedded in some elements of our government this is, because whether it was the FBI or the local police chief in Omaha or various officials, they were either part of it or protective of it. And I'm sure that's not the only place, so to speak. Washington, D.C., which is where they seem to be traveling all the time.
With the Franklin's credit union and the financial aspect, do you think any of it leads to Warren Buffett?
Let me tell you this. In my book, when it came out, a group of attorneys had kind of a press conference and so on. This is the most libelous, slanderous book that's ever been written, and this man will be destroyed. DeCamp will be destroyed for writing blah, 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 blah. And I immediately had a reply. And my reply was, look, I agree these are the most horrible things ever could be said about anybody ever that I can imagine. I said, but the rest of the story is, I was very careful. If I wrote something, I had the backup to prove it. I have it 10 times as much, but I didn't write, because I don't have the absolute, what I feel is strong proof in a courtroom that would, You could say absolutely yes or no. I said, so go ahead and sue. There was one lawsuit, but that was by me against Great Atlantic Telecast Company, some big network on the East Coast out of, I don't know, North Carolina and various places. Anyway, and they had a presidential candidate who was very prominent in the book, and a former senator named Bob Kerrey. And Bob was in Wilmington giving a presidential speech, as was a former Omaha police chief named Wadman, who now is the police chief in Wilmington, North Carolina. And they went on television there and said, what a...
Now he's in Wilmington, North Carolina?
No. Back then, he went from Omaha, where he, anyway...
Then he went to Aurora, Illinois.
And then Wilmington, North
then
Carolina.
Wilmington, okay.
Anyway, and they had said some things on television, oh, this is lies and so on. So I sued the Great Atlantic Telecast Company because they tended to agree with other newscasters. Well, that's it. Anyway, so I sued them for libel and slander. And guess what? They first told me to go jump in the lake, and I said, you check it out, I'll give you 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, their lawyers met with me, and they settled and paid me damages and had to publicly apologize on the station, I think 2 nights on the evening news, 2 nights in a row to the senator from Nebraska, blah, blah, blah. But they paid me damages. I'm not allowed to disclose the amount of the damages. By law, we settled. I received the money from them, but let me say it was more than $1 and less than $100,001.
Okay. I'm from Littleton, Colorado myself, and I personally know a lot of the students and parents who were affected that day in the shootings. You were asked by at least one of the families to become involved in that. What was your involvement in?
I filed a lawsuit on behalf of one of the kids. And my fundamental claim was that one of the drugs this boy, Harris, was taking, my lawsuit claimed then that one of the major effects of this particular drug causes teenagers particularly to be suicidal. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
And to make a long story short, of course, you're fighting Solvay was the drug company involved. They manufacture whatever the drugs are.
Can you spell that?
Solvay. I don't. Anyway, and of course the drug companies fight it with a passion and bring in the toughest people in the world. I kept battling, but the amazing thing to me is the careful control. As I say, this is why I've become a little cynical about government, because it seems that at key places there are government officials that don't always do what the people need and want and should receive. Unfortunately and tragically, and I hope it changes someday, I can't talk about certain things. I'm the only person who's taken a deposition of the Harris family, of the doctors that were treating this young boy, and I'm the only one who's seen, other than certain certain officials, all kinds of things in this case that are now sealed, and they're trying to be destroyed, as you know. And in fact, I had 2 federal marshals show up in my office, law office, when the judge ordered these things sealed and record destroyed, to go through my files to take copies of, if you can believe it, certain depositions I had taken. So all I can do now, because I finally stepped out of the lawsuit and the kid settled for, got a settlement of a few $1,000s or something that's secret and whatever. My claim there that these drugs cause a certain amount of children to be very suicidal. Where they just want to do it in a dramatic fashion and so on and so forth. And just study the whole picture of what actually happened there in Columbine. And if they ever release or don't destroy all the records on this case. I think you'll find that that is the most accurate lawsuit that was ever filed on this whole thing. But what is most interesting, once the lawsuit was dismissed, and their penny dollars they paid the kid, once that was done, what has happened since then? The federal government and the drug companies have all reached agreements that on these particular drugs now, these antidepressant drugs, they have to put all kinds of big notices, and that's the first big notice there is on the drug about how they cause suicide in children, so on and so forth, young people. You do know that, right? You can't pick any of those major ones now that isn't there. And I have no doubt that someday, and this is my opinion, so Mr. Court officials, you can't do anything, this is my belief and opinion, personal, okay, from just everything. I have no doubt that the drugs were a major factor in this boy committing suicide and, contrary to what most people maybe know or think, executing his own buddy, Klebold there, killing him when Klebold didn't want to die. And you just had to see all these basement tapes they made and know the whole story, and you'd have no doubt. But those are the things they won't release or let the public have, and they keep talking about destroying, and I don't know how much has been destroyed now, but if you ever saw those basement tapes and all that stuff, you would have no doubt.
No, I thought the official story was that they each committed suicide individually.
And my answer to that is bullshit.
All right. Thank you for that.
Mr. Klebold, Mr. Harris is there. I think Mr. Klebold maybe wasn't quite as willing to blow his own brains out, so Mr. Harris, I believe, helped him. Was I there? No. Did I see it? No. I'm just going on the basis of
I thought
a lot
you
of
did see
factors.
some of the tapes from the high school.
I saw all the stuff. All the stuff, including the basement tapes, including this, including that. I'm just telling you what I believe. I believe. Anyway, there's no doubt in my mind that the key factor. See, Mr. Harris, the boy, had learned to manipulate even the drugs, double up or triple up, then go off them for a few days, and get the exciting effects of this and that, and feel like King Kong, you can kill anybody, and he learned the whole mechanism. Has any of that ever come out? No.
In the video games?
The video games, of course, my lawsuit also involved that, by the way. How they lived and breathed those video games. They were real for them.
Tell me about your recent election, because you ran for Nebraska Senator
Oh, I stupidly,
in 06, right?
yeah, put my name on the ballot just for the heck of it.
What?
I didn't really do any campaigning. I just thought I'd try to get back into politics, and then I had a back surgery, and that pretty well made me lay low and stay out.
But
Whatever.
the polling had you go.
The polling had me all
68% or something.
number one, and yes, I lost good.
But only in those precincts that have electronic voting machines.
That's true. Only in precincts with electronic voting machines, and the ones where it's hand counted and all that, I won like 2-1 or more. Do I have some suspicions and beliefs? Absolutely. Do I believe there's a possibility that not everything is perfect in our voting system in the country? Yes. Do I have proof? Not yet.
What is the status of some of the movies that are in the works? You said that we're going to follow up on.
Oh, there's been a couple outfits here and want to start and do things, and I've told them I'll cooperate and help them, but I gotta make a living and take care of myself too, and I can't just stop everything. I guess a former New York Times writer is coming out with a book. He spent about a year, half the time living in my house, and his book is supposed to be on the market in the next 3 months or 4 months.
Who was that?
Nick Bryant's his name.
Oh.
And he carefully interviewed all these people that I had, and a lot more. And
Now he focused mostly on the Franklin scandal, right?
yeah,
Not on the other.
not on the other, no, just. And that British television team, their movie was Discovery Channel, and all the television
Yorkshire or Yorktown, or what was it?
Yorkshire TV.
Yorkshire, yeah.
They're a major TV network over there, and they had a team over here
Have they done some
during the
follow-up?
Franklin thing. No, you heard what happened to them. Their thing was put on TV. It aired one night and it got stopped.
Oh, I did. I thought it got prevented from being on the Discovery Channel at all.
I think as I understand it, it showed on one preliminary thing and then got stopped. And some company bought up all rights, paid them off. The interesting thing was the only reason there is a copy of it, pirated copy, was director, whatever you call him, was so bitter because he thought it was going to win national award as best documentary and so on and so forth.
As it
And he had
should
actually
have.
won something like that years before, so this was his new one. And so maybe a pirated copy of it ended up,
In your mailbox.
well, in a mailbox here in the United States with somebody who maybe let other people have copies, and it's kind of spread. It's called Conspiracy of Silence, and if you go back in the newspapers and TV magazines and everything back in that 96 or something, I don't remember what date it was, but you go back then, it was widely advertised for the Conspiracy of Silence to show on Discovery Channel, and then it never happened and disappeared.
Can you, just in case I'm not able to get any first-hand interviews, do you provide any updates on some of the principal people, like what's happened to Paul Benassi since then?
Paul Benassi is married, has 2 beautiful children, keeps in touch with me every once in a while, and he's a fine young man.
Good for
And
him.
people still harass him.
Rusty Nelson.
Rusty, he was the central photographer, and he skipped out and escaped, and he ended up in prison in Oregon, and that's when I got a call from one of the top detectives there, and they said, "Do you ever hear of a guy named Rusty Nelson?" I said, "Yeah." This is way at the height of the Franklin thing. I said, "Yeah." I said, "Are you DeCamp?" And I go, "Of course." And he says, "Well, what do you know about him?" I said, "Well, I know nothing other than he was involved in this Franklin thing." And so I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we arrested somebody, and he has this book called The Franklin Coverup." It was my first edition when I first. And he says, and he's got all these parts underlined that mention him. I says, "Holy mackerel!" And they said, so I went out and saw him.
And that's the
interviewed
first time you...
Absolutely. And he spilled everything to me, which I was able, of course, to add more to the book. And they had seized tens of thousands of pictures, and they let me look at those. Then I tried to get them, and then other people stepped in, and I think they've got them destroyed by now. But that was then the next thing I did. The most important thing then was I got Rusty Nelson out of prison back to testify in the case involving lawsuit against Larry King, and he actually was able to get some of his secret pictures he had hidden in different places of Larry King and various other things, and that's how we
into the court record?
ended up doing big things, along with another key witness in that case, Noreen Gosh, in the famous Gosh case, the first boy that his mother had led the effort to get pictures of kidnapped or children on milk cartons, and became very active because this Paul Benassi had described how he was involved in the kidnapping of this boy back when they were both 12 years old. They used one boy as, kind of the bait. The other, the Benassi boy, the Gosh boy was out delivering papers, and there's Paul Benassi out there, 12-year-old kid too, and they stopped, and then these men grabbed him, and Paul told everything and described it. And to make a long story short, the Gosh family, I wrote them in contact and said, "I don't know if any of this is true, this strange, weird story, but if you'd like." So they came, they interviewed.
That was your initial contact with Noreen Gosh? Was...
No, that's even more sinister and strange. That was my initial contact with, quote, I'll use the phrase, the Gosh family. With the father, let's say. And
Because he kept a lot of evidence from Noreen for years.
I'm not going to go into that. So the Gosh family, absolutely, they had their own investigator. Benassi was able to provide them stuff where stuff was hidden, places where they had both been. on and on. So Noreen Gosh, this is a really complicated tale then, because there might have been some more sinister, evil stuff that I don't want to go into here. But anyway, there was no question Benassi was telling the truth on this, whether it was polygraph tests that were taken, whether it was other proof. He was the only one that, other than the family, that knew certain birthmarks and other things on the boy, of course, from what he and the other boy, anyway. But yeah, that was just one more thing in the book that I wrote about that came out of this Franklin thing as I kept digging in and pulling strings.
Now these boys ended up supposedly on a ranch in Colorado.
That's correct.
Colonel Michael Aquino's ranch? Do you know where that?
I'm not going to go into who owned or didn't own ranches or anything. Michael Aquino is prominently mentioned in my book. Michael Aquino was a very prominent individual, as you know, in the military, and he's been accused of many things, including being involved in this type of activity. I was scheduled for a debate with him in California years ago, and it was most interesting the way things developed. He was coming on, they were going to have him on the radio, very prominent station out there, to refute and discount and disprove all kinds of things that were being claimed about him at the time. Not in my book, but all in lots of things. You remember? Lots of accusations were made. And I, unknown to him, was brought in by the radio station to be sitting there ready to debate with him.
I didn't know that.
Oh yes, this is a real event. And at the last minute, he finds out that I'm there. So he refuses then to participate further and quits. And I offer all kinds of things that clearly prove he's full of you-know-what and up to his eyebrows in lies, and maybe it was a dirty trick for the radio station to do, but I thought it was rather interesting. Yes. Santa Clara, California. That's where the radio thing was done. And
Approximately when was that?
oh, in the 90s, mid-90s, I'm sure, somewhere in there. Yeah, it was a shock to him when old John was sitting there with proof, and my proof was pretty good because it was directly from his own family.
You had an interesting, we kind of touched on it, your background. Didn't your parents come to Nebraska on the orphan train? Or
My mother did,
your
yes.
mother?
Orphan train.
Which was quite a historical phenomenon. And then you ended up, and then how did you end up in Boys Town?
After I left the monastery, I stopped at Boys Town. I thought, well, heck, I mean, if I had a place to go to school, I was pretty young. And I was there about 2 weeks, and then they told me I had to give up my car. And I said, no. They said, well, you can't live here and have a car, unlike all the other children. I said, okay. I got on the road and went on down the road. But then, left Boys Town, went to New York, got a job, sold my car, got a job on a freighter.
At age?
I was about 16.
16.
Anyway, that job on a freighter, and ended up in Persia, Persia, Iran. And I used to speak Farsi, their language, better than I speak English. And that's why as I watch this war today, and I've lived over there, and know the religious and the nature of the people better than these clowns here, I'll give you a letter if you want that I wrote to Senator Hagel, who everybody's biting on now, and he is doing exactly 1,000,000,000% exactly as I wrote in my letter. So everything that's going on now, I'll give you a copy of this letter I sent to Hagel long ago, and he knows my background real well, and knew I
Maybe he's
has developed just like I said in the letter it would, the Shias and the Sunnis and on. And so you take the letter, and you'll be the first person outside of them, he and Senator Ben Nelson, to have that letter.
Thank you. Okay, then one final question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you said you had made a promise to your good friend William Colby to investigate and tell people about the militia and the Patriot movement.
Yeah, I never wrote that. I never did that.
Is that in the
I
works?
am still going to do something. I started and I got about half done. And things were changing and evolving so quickly, you know, in this country. I think now that the stuff is coming out on the FBI, I am going to tell a lot of things Bill told me that. I'll give you one example, okay? You're the first one I kind of told this to. You know, they finally admitted we tried to assassinate Castro.
Well, also E. Howard Hunt came out with a deathbed confession just a month ago.
What was his deathbed confession?
Well, that he was privy to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and that it was Johnson who wanted the office, and that E. Howard Hunt said he was just a bench warmer, but isn't.
Okay. Anyway, so Colby used to always say, you know, Allende, you know who Allende was? Anyway, he said, you know, that's one assassination that we always get blamed for that we didn't do. We're happy it got done. We get blamed, we didn't do it. Anyway, then he would tell me about the Kennedy, or Castro assassination. You know, I've got the details. Now, they finally admitted here in the last 2 weeks, you know, on TV with the revealing of the stuff about, well, there was an attempt to poison Castro. Let me tell you how it was done. That's the interesting part. They found this gal. They had this gal that was brought to him, I think, by like the equivalent of the mafia or whatever, and she was like his private mistress, you know. So anyway, they knew that from her that he used this particular type of toothpaste. So what they did was they got an exact duplicate, only to put this real terrible poison that the moment you put it on, it'd kill you. So anyway, the gal is to sneak that in and replace his existing toothpaste with this toothpaste. You follow? So she is walking across whatever to put it there, and she slips and drops it and steps on it. And well, what's his name comes out and sees that, and he wonders what she's doing with it. And then he looks in and he sees his own toothpaste in there, and he gets suspicious. And the rest is history. The girl ended up, of course, dead.
Did he end up giving the toothpaste to her?
Huh? No, but he
Caught on.
He caught it. So anyway, that's how the real event occurred. I've known that for years. Colby always used to laugh about that one. You know, we can try some of these assassinations, and it just seems it was always a screw up. Always anyway. Okay, I'll go for the while.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
I haven't had an OxyContin or even a pain pill in 2.5 months now.
You serious?
Yeah, the doctors decided I was rapidly addicting myself on what they were doing to me.
Right. Exactly.
So they wanted me to consider going for a couple weeks to rehab, and I said, shit, I'll just quit. They said, well, most people can't do that. I said, if I can't, I'll let you know, but I'm going to just quit. And I quit, and I will tell you, I understand now about drug addicts. The first 11 to 13 days, I thought I was in hell, you know what I mean? It is really difficult. I see what they mean when you get hooked on these. I can imagine these drug addicts. The only way to get them off, I think, is lock them up for a month or two or whatever. And only 1 in 100 does that. He says, Rush Limbaugh couldn't, and so on and so forth couldn't. Why do you think you can? I says, because I'll do it. I literally, on the spot, said, I'm not going to take another one, and I don't want you giving me any more shots or anything else. And I never had a single thing from that day forward. Roughly 2.5 months now. And they just finally concluded, hey, we've overdone it. I knew something was wrong. My entire office staff was telling me, you're flaky.
Well, I can't believe you went through all that just since I saw you last.
Yep. When did you two do that interview?
July 8th.
Oh, okay, so that... Yeah, it was right about then when we had the showdown with the doctors, and they were the ones that told me, legally, technically, we think you're addicted because we've put too much in you.
Because we addicted you.
Because we addicted you. Yeah, they made no question about that. Because I didn't take any excess. I just took what the nurses poured into me and everything else. And they were the ones that concluded. Anyway, so I just went cold turkey.
But you have flexibility. You can actually...
Well, that was why they did this surgery, because it was either that or a wheelchair. And I said, take the risky one and let's do it that way. And it's worked out. It's still a lot of pain, but I'll live with it.
You think it'll get
but
better?
I learned a lesson. Stay out of wars in places like Vietnam.
We should all heed that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. Speaking of Vietnam, what point did you gather around the table at the peace talks?
oh, this was in the 70s. Well, hell, it might have been in the 80s even. Started out, a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, a Vietnamese friend who happened to be the son of the man who had been elected president and then was assassinated.
Elected president of
Vietnam.
Vietnam. Okay.
He then and his family pretty well escaped to Paris.
What's his name?
His name was Tran Van Tong,
Okay.
and I just know him as Tran Van and nothing else. I mean, we're pretty close. He lives in Paris. He comes here every year it was for a while. But anyway, Tran Van was obsessed with getting the story of the Vietnam War and things like what happened to his father and who really did what and everything else out. And so he organized this thing for Paris at exactly the same place and at the same table that they had originally done the Paris peace talks. And I assisted him to the degree I could, but I thought his chances of doing this are like 1 in 10 trillion, you know. To my shock, amazement, and everything else, he got, I would say, the 15 most involved people in that war that there were on the planet Earth, including Kissinger, Colby, you know, the head of the CIA over there, and on and on. Interestingly enough, the generals from North Vietnam and South Vietnam who had escaped and were now refugees, and ambassador, some of the people from Paris that had been involved. And I mean, he really, and the deal was, and it was good, they did it. It was one of the least covered things in the United States and the most publicized things in Europe and the rest of the world there was. For some reason, the United States didn't want that. Anyway, so it got minimal press over here. It got press, but not like, you know, Europe and every place else. Anyway, but
would
the
it
deal
have
was,
reflected poorly on the U.S. or why would it?
I guess somebody must have thought so. I don't know how they do the press. I don't claim to. I have discovered, though, in my old age that sometimes the things you think should be the most publicized end up not getting much attention, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, so I think once Colby and Kissinger and some of those people had agreed to go there, it just kind of brought them in from North Vietnam and South Vietnam and different countries. The key people that were involved as generals and decision makers and surrenderers and whatever were there. And the deal was they would give their little talk and then open it up to questions. And they kind of kept the press out pretty heavily because it was going to be one of these open deals. We're going to blow it out straight and give our opinions, you know. So they did do that. So maybe one of the reasons it didn't get press as much as it should have over here. But anyway, and it was most interesting, you know, as different sides just answered the questions and you pretty well kind of came to understand the war. But the interesting part for me, I was one of the speakers, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that.
15 or 20, yeah. Had an hour talk from the perspective of a young soldier over there who became disenchanted, concerned. We weren't allowed to win. We weren't allowed to lose. That was my famous campaign slogan. And the fact that I had actually run first, last, and only one in the history of the United States to run for senator without ever setting foot in the United States and win the election. That's what I did. You know, I ran the campaign for Vietnam. In fact, I was going out on a chopper one day to probably slaughter somebody, and we picked up the Stars and Stripes, you know, the official milk, and that's where I read it in there. Army captain in Vietnam wins election for senator back in the United States. Whoa, give me that paper.
Oh, you read it in the paper?
Yes.
You hadn't even heard it
I
yet.
don't know, but I grabbed that paper. Anyway, I was going to say, so it was really interesting, but maybe the most interesting part for me was I knew Kissinger had been the key man to fire Colby. When Ford got elected president, or not elected, when Ford got in as president because of Nixon's resignation, Kissinger, one of the first things he did was made sure he got rid of Colby. Why? I can only tell you what Colby
was
tells
one of
me.
Okay.
Colby says the reason was because he Colby had exposed, quote to speak, the sins of the war and the sins of the CIA, and gone before the U.S. Congress and said, hey, it is out of control, we need to change it, and embarrassed the administration and everything. And so they got rid of him real quick. And even though he had been head of the CIA and the top CIO person over in Vietnam, during the war, deputy ambassador officially in name. But anyway, so when those two agreed to sit down over the lunch hour, which lasted about 2 hours between the morning and then when the afternoon session started, I said, okay if I come along? Colby says, okay by me. And Colby looks and says, don't know who you are, but I got nothing against you. I mean, Kissinger says that. And so I said, okay. And I sat down. And one thing led to another, and maybe the most interesting revelation that I'm absolutely sure is 100% true, even though I've never really seen it anywhere else, that came out was who was Deep Throat. Who was Deep Throat? You know Deep Throat in the great Watergate thing. And Colby says something to Kissinger like, well, the CIA spent a fortune on that, and I think we have the answer. And Kissinger says, well, interestingly enough, Bill, I think we at the White House had the answer too. We spent a lot of energy, effort, and resources, and we know who it was too. And then they both kind of gibbered back and forth, and then one said to the other, okay, who do you say it was? And guess what the answer is? Colby says, we at the CIA know there was no Deep Throat. Deep Throat was merely a combination of all the information these guys were getting from different sources, but they had to have something to validate and get the Washington Post to go forward, and so they had this mysterious Deep Throat. So they might have a piece of information from this key person, or a key piece of information, this one in the White House, and so on and so forth, but they had Deep Throat supposedly right up next to the president and everything, validating or proving everything. Kissinger looks at him and he says, Bill, I'm going to tell you something. And I was thinking he was going to tell him, you're wrong, you're full of beans. He says, you just said the only thing you and I have ever agreed upon. And I thought, my God. And so I started asking some questions myself. I said, well, how could they do this and have a fictitious person? And Kissinger says, a young man, and I was a little bit younger then, 35 years ago or 30 or whatever it was. Anyway, he's a young man. A lot goes on that won't make sense to you, but believe me, if you've been in politics very long, you'll learn that the world isn't perfect, and sometimes black is white, up is down, and right is left. And in this case, he said, Colby is absolutely right. And he says, and I'm surprised he and the company meaning the CIA, reached that conclusion, because that's what the White House has known for a long time, and we never disclosed it. And it was kind of funny. Then I watched over the years, somebody saying, oh, so-and-so is Deep Throat and so-and-so, and then this latest deal where this guy supposedly was Deep Throat. Baloney. He was just one who may have thought mentally he was somebody important, but it was a combination of all the little pieces of information, and Washington Post editors wouldn't go forward unless they had a source. You follow?
Yeah.
Just like media does. And so the source was this fiction that they created. What's his name? Both Colby and Kissinger that day agreed. They believe on his death or something, he'll leave the information so that they'll realize kind of how great a reporter he really was to have done this, because he got the information, got rid of the president and everything else, and was a completely fictitious character. That's God's truth. I'm not making any of this up. You can give me a lie detector polygraph test. Because I still find it shocking, but the more I've watched, the more believable it is. You see this guy that they say, well, he did this or he knew this. And It's just a combination of all his information he was gathering, and he had to have, quote, a whatever source.
So, do you see that as parallel to what they're using today as Al Qaeda?
I developed a real strong policy after my first book came out, because so many people were threatening me, and I thought, man, if I can't prove it to the point where they even have to accept it absolutely, I ain't going to say it. I may give an opinion, I may suggest thoughts with respect to Al Qaeda. I have really strong mixed feelings because, as you know, I kind of lived and grew up there. Used to speak that lingo, Farsi, Iran.
Can you say something in Farsi?
Shaman Farsi mi donim, Farsi mi donam, es mi chomachis. Chansaldari.
No, you'll have to translate.
Oh, I said, do you speak Farsi? I speak Farsi. What's your name? How old are you? Where do you live? But anyway, so it was one incredible experience, but I also really was so overwhelmed and impressed by it that when I went to college later, particularly the religions there, a mix of the religions, the conflict between them, so on and so forth. I majored in philosophy of religions of the world, and that was what my degree was in before I went to law school. And just some phenomenal things occurring. That
Isn't it true that the word Al Qaeda didn't even exist until 8 years ago or something?
my understanding correct.
And that it literally means the base.
The base or the standard, I don't know.
Is it, what language is it, do you know? I mean, can you literally,
Well,
is it Farsi?
Certainly Farsi, but it probably also is Sunni, Arabic too. I suspect it's one of those crossover words.
Because I've also heard that it was really devised from a database. And I'm thinking that the base...
I have heard that too. Do I know? No. And if I don't know, I don't say.
You don't say.
I heard the same thing.
Okay. So, last time we spoke, you had great optimism about what Senator Chuck Hagel was doing and where he was going, and
Well,
he's mysteriously...
I got to know him pretty well, going back a long way, and technically I was a candidate on the same ballot that Hagel ran against Nelson. You follow? And so we got to know each other pretty well there, and then subsequent to that, he was a Vietnam vet and everything. And got to respect his talents a lot, so I sent this letter to him because Benny Nelson, the other Nebraska senator, who had been one of my teachers when I was in college, a philosophy teacher, he had personally asked me if I would meet with him a couple times, which I did, and give him my take on the war, since I had, in college, just returned from Persia, Iran, and he was kind of impressed and remembered me real well, and then later I was the senator and he was head of insurance or whatever. So he met with me and asked me what I thought about it, and I told him what was going to happen, what I thought would happen. And so then I sent the same letter to him and Chuck Hagel, and it's remarkable to me that, God forbid me for saying this, but Hagel has followed the letter almost to the letter, so to speak, in his statements, actions, demands, and whatever. Of course, as a consequence, he's not going to be able to run now, had to drop out, because I think he got Mr. Bush so unhappy that...
Because he was doing the right thing.
I think he was doing what he believed in. I think he was doing what he thought was necessary. I think he was doing what he thought represented the people. And I think he was also taking a lot of input from my letter. You've read my letter, right? And did you see that article from 20, 30 years ago that's headlines in the World Herald called me the prophet because I had predicted the oil crisis and the what's his name, who was Ayatollah Khomeini. I predicted, before anybody even heard of his name, I predicted he was going to take over and it would completely change and we'd almost be at war with him. And then of course they had the hostage crisis and everything. So anyway, it was kind of interesting because they had that old article I had that old article from the World Herald 30 years ago that said DeCamp, prophet of Iranian crisis. So I sent that to them too, and so they knew I wasn't just making something up. I had some background in it.
So you really do, fella. Well, great prophet. What do you see for Iran now?
Let me give you some background and understanding that most Americans don't have. Iran is about 90% Shiite. Most of the Shiites, 80% probably, of all the Shiites in the world are located in Iran. Next biggest place for the Shiites, and they're the real strict, super strict ones, you understand? Like, no ifs, ands, or buts.
Orthodox, or whatever. Is there an Orthodox Shiite, or?
They would be the super Orthodox, okay? Iraq is where the next biggest group of Shiites are. Even though it's only a fraction of what they have in Iran, it is a majority in Iraq. You follow? Because Iraq doesn't have that big a population, number one. So they have about, I don't know, maybe 55% Shiite and maybe 40% Sunni. And then the Kurds kind of live off by themselves in different tribal areas. I spent a lot of time with them. I can tell you some great stories.
You're aware of false flag terror events that have happened. Do you see? Yes, do you acknowledge that?
Yes, I acknowledge.
And I'm not naming any, except maybe historically we can, Gulf of Tonkin, which is now declassified. Do you see something similar happening in Iran? Do you predict this as the prophet to justify going to war?
There are those that believe that. I see it as a real possibility.
But you don't know.
I would hope our government had not gone to the lengths that would require to have kind of a secret plan going all on so you can deliberately start a war. You understand? So I hope that's not true. I recognize the possibility and that a lot of people maybe believe that. I sure don't know. I fear something like that. But
do you see our government as being the ones making the ultimate decision in that anyway?
Or do you think it'll be the Iranians?
No, I think it's the global entity that probably has hands in both governments.
Probably a lot of truth in that, but do I know?
No.
Do I say if I don't know? No.
No. Okay, fair enough.
Hey, did you hear the story on the news here yesterday or the day before about Senator Ernie Chambers from Nebraska suing God?
No. Tell me more.
Well, he did. It got all kinds of national news because he was suing God to make a point, and so I've got a copy of the lawsuit here I'm going to give you because who knows?
Did he make his point?
God may reply. Or maybe his prophet.